I'm going to do a couple of quick introductions, and then I will get out of the way because folks are not here to see me. Before we get going, I just want to say our bookseller tonight is Kelly's Books to Go. You'll be seeing some links in the chat to her bookshop page and website. So if you want to order one of the books or one or more of the books of these great authors tonight, I suggest you do that. That will be super easy to do. So, and everybody should be on mute. If you're not one of our folks talking tonight, so make sure you were automatically muted when you came in. So I'm going to get right into the introductions. So our first writer was trained as a medical doctor, and Tess Gerritsen built a second career as an internationally best-selling author of 28 suspense novels. Her series of crime novels featuring homicide detective Jane Rizzoli and medical examiner Maura Isles inspired the TNT hit Rizzoli and Isles. Among her titles are Harvest, Gravity, The Surgeon, Playing with Fire, and The Shape of the Night, or The Shape of Night. Her books are translated into 40 languages and more than 30 million copies have been sold around the world. Welcome to Tess. A native New Yorker, James Hayman worked in advertising for over 30 years before moving to Portland to continue his writing career and landed on the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and USA Today. Bestseller list. His first thriller, The Cutting, features Portland detectives Mike McCabe and Maggie Savage. His latest, A Fatal Obsession, is available online and in bookstores. And last but not least, the former military brat, New York Times and USA Today bestselling novelist Julia Spencer-Fleming grew up in places as diverse as Rome, Stuttgart, and Syracuse. And she used her army pass and keen eye for the goings-on at her Episcopal church to create Claire Ferguson, first female priest in the small Adirondack town of Miller's Kill. The resulting series has won or been nominated for almost every American Mystery Award available. And our moderator for tonight is none other than Bob Keyes, who has written about arts and culture for the Portland Press Herald and Maine Sunday Telegram since 2002. He received an inaugural Rabkin Prize for Visual Arts Journalism in 2017, recognizing his essential voice in the regional arts conversation. And in 2014, the Maine Writers and Publishers Alliance honored him with its Distinguished Achievement Award. So thanks to Bob for moderating this. Thanks to everyone for being here. And we will be taking questions in the Q&A in the chat box, and I'll see you all later. Enjoy the conversation.
Well, thank you very much, Gibson. Welcome, everybody. I want to thank everybody out there for joining us, and to Gibson and the folks at NWPA for inviting me to participate. And of course, a big thanks to the crime and suspense writers on the panel who've agreed to share their thoughts and perhaps some of their secrets. Tonight's theme is timely and apt, writing about who we are not. We're going to talk about what it means to write outside your experience. That's something I think novelists do to various degrees all the time, and I imagine each of you has your own way of doing it. How do you write convincingly in the voice or the persona of someone who is completely different than you are in gender, race, nationality, sexual orientation? It's always been important to get it right, but it feels especially vital now as we pay more attention to fairness, equity, and inclusion. So let's start the conversation on that note. Jim, I'm going to turn to you to get things going. In one of your early books, Chill of the Night, a central character is a young woman who's struggling with mental health issues. Tell us about her character, why you chose the condition of schizophrenia for a major character in your book, and how did you become familiar with her condition, and how did you learn to write about it so effectively?
Well, that was kind of a challenge, actually. I thought it would be very interesting before I even got into developing the character to have somebody with mental illness be the witness to a crime and have the villain, the criminal, chasing after her. But before I did that, I had to learn about schizophrenia. I tried reading some, technical professional tomes on the symptoms and the medical view of schizophrenics. And that really wasn't terribly helpful. So I then turned to memoirs and read 3 or 4 different memoirs written by schizophrenics describing in very personal terms their own experiences with the disease. The most memorable of these, which I would recommend anybody interested in the subject to read, was by a woman named Ellen Sachs, S-A-K-S, like the store. And she was a brilliant woman, but she had been trained by her parents through tough love never to take drugs. So when the schizophrenia arrived, it went rampant. And she tried to commit suicide a number of times, and she would hear voices all the time. Nonetheless, she managed to get first in her class at Vanderbilt, PhD from Oxford, and a medical degree from the University of California at San Diego. So she's quite somebody. But she really gave me insights into what schizophrenia was like. And she became the basis for a lot of the interior thoughts of my character, Abby Quinn, in The Chill of Night.
When you created the character, did you run it past people? Did you suggest your story to other authors so you could ask for their feedback who might have some expertise?
I did. I think I always do that. I mean, I think we all probably show trusted readers to look at our work and give their reactions to it. But Abby was really very much somebody who grew out of my own mind with the help of Ellen Sachs. And she is a young 20-year-old girl who lives on something I called Hearts Island, but was really Peaks Island. And she witnesses a horrible murder. And when she tells the police about this horrible murder, the cop on the island doesn't believe her because he knows she's schizophrenic. She has hallucinations. She hears voices. She's tried to kill herself a number of times. And so he dismisses her. He drives her back to her house and says, "Leave me alone." But she knows that the bad guy is coming after her because she has witnessed the murder. And very much of the story is about how she flees in great terror from this bad guy, and how McCabe and Savage eventually, thank goodness, rescue her.
You mentioned Ellen Sachs. Did you have a correspondence with her with this character in mind?
I did not have a correspondence. The book is so, and I would urge anybody interested in schizophrenia as a disease to read it. It's a masterful piece, and she's a extraordinary woman. I didn't feel it necessary to talk to her. I mean, the book explained everything.
Yep. Good. All right. Well, I want to come back to Abby in a little bit. Tess, I have a question for you. You write from the benefit of experience much of the time, at least in a broad sense. You're trained as a medical doctor, as Gibson noted in the introduction, and you've become a best-selling novelist when you began writing medical thrillers and books with a medical examiner as a central character. But you step out of your comfort zone quite often, and your latest, The Shape of the Night, is a supernatural thriller with a character who sees ghosts. How did you pull that character off, and what research did you do in order to understand that condition?
Well, my research started as a child because my mother saw ghosts as a child, when she was young in China. So I grew up with ghost stories. I've always been looking for a ghost all my life, and I've never seen one, probably because I'm such a skeptic. They shy away from me. So it was more a matter of, I think, diving into the idea that maybe they do exist. It also helps to be living in Maine because we are reputedly one of the most haunted states in the country. I have a good friend who said her house is haunted by a friendly ghost, a ghost who she feels protects her. And you take it one step further. Okay, maybe you live with a friendly ghost, and maybe he's also a sexy ghost. And then the story took off from there. What really, if you're a lonely woman living in a house, a huge house, and you're living there with a really sexy sea captain's ghost, what better circumstances are there?
Right. So do you do interviews with some of these folks?
No,
What did you do for research?
I did a lot of research into ghost hunting because there is a ghost hunter in the story. But in truth, the ghost is almost a secondary part of the story. So that really wasn't important. I think what I was really struggling with in that particular tale is sex scenes. Sex scenes are the hardest things in the world to write, especially when one of the partners is not human. He's not real. And so it's like, what would it be like to have sex with a ghost? That's where the writer's imagination comes in, because there's no way to do research on that.
Right, absolutely. Have you done a lot of sex scenes?
I used to do romance novels.
Yes.
My career started off writing for Harlequin Intrigue, which is the romantic suspense line. So I've written, I have to think back now, eight or nine romantic suspense novels, and those almost demanded a sex scene just because the audience expected it. And I always found that they were really difficult to write, partly because there's the giggle factor. And in fact, this is a large part of what this whole topic tonight is all about. It's men viewing women and women viewing men. When you write a scene in which sex happens, do you do it from the male point of view or the female point of view? Because the descriptions will be very, very different. I think the experiences are probably very, very different. I mean, I'm not just mean anatomically, I mean emotionally, perhaps.
Absolutely.
I don't know, because I'm not a man. No.
When you moved from the romance to the medical thrillers, or whatever the proper term is, what prompted that decision? Was it an opportunity to write about something that you knew a little bit more about, perhaps, or was it a comfort level?
It was just my books are never, I want to write this and then I want to write that. It's always, oh, what a great idea. It's just something that comes to you. And I had heard a story from a homicide police officer who said that children were disappearing from the streets in Moscow in Russia, and he was convinced they were being sent off to the Middle East as organ donors. And that got the whole story of Harvest started. It had nothing to do with romance. It was just, I want to write this story and I don't care what the genre is. And I think most of my career has been that way. I just want to write this story and I don't care what category you're going to put it in.
Yep. Okay. Well, I'm going to come back to you as well. Hello, Julia. How are you?
I'm good, but I just have to say,
Yeah.
So I live almost alone in a big old house, and I want a sexy sea captain ghost. I want to know how I get one.
You can write one.
Kind of the ideal man, right? It's like there when you want him, and then he disappears.
And you don't have to cook breakfast for them. You don't have to wash their clothes. It's like perfect.
That's funny. Well, you can write one up whenever you feel so compelled. So I want to at least start our part of the conversation with a discussion about two of your best-known characters, Claire Ferguson and Russ Van Alstyne. Is that the right pronunciation?
Either Alstein or Alstein.
Okay.
Both are good.
They're husband and wife from upstate New York, and they're part of many of your books, including your latest, Hid from Our Eyes. She's a minister. He's a police chief. I want to start with Russ. First of all, in your own words, describe Russ. Give him some context about who he is and talk about some of the techniques you employ as a woman when writing about a dominant male character.
Yeah, I write my books from a close third person, which means it doesn't say me and I, but when I'm putting it from a character's point of view, we are seeing and experiencing everything from inside the skin of a man or a woman or a young person or an old person. So Russ is really kind of a classic mystery protagonist. You know, he is, when the series opens, he's about 48. He's gruff, he's honest to a ridiculous degree. He's fairly cynical because he's been an MP. He was a career MP and then was a cop afterwards. You know, I really wanted somebody who could be like the hero. But not that sort of romantic, too good to be true hero. He tends to be very stubborn. He and Claire fight a lot. So, you know, I needed somebody. Actually, the thing is that we can start by talking with Russ, but Russ actually comes out of starting with Claire, because she's the person that the character I came up with first. And I wanted somebody who was young, and she's obviously religious. She's an Episcopal priest. She is very new. She's a Virginian who's new to this upstate New York area, which is very, very much like New England. And she's very impetuous. And so I gave her all of these qualities. And then I went looking for her counterpart who would have the exact opposite qualities. Because when you've got two characters who are opposite, they tend to clash a lot. They create conflict, and conflict is the engine that drives, the narrative forward, and it makes it much more interesting reading.
So did you create Claire first? Is that what did I hear that? Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Got her first.
You drew on your background growing up in an Episcopal household, I assume?
Yeah, some of the aspects of what I came up with when I started the series fall squarely under the old write what you know adage. So I am a lifelong Episcopalian. I am a military brat. My father was Air Force. My late husband was Air Force. My son is serving in the Navy right now. So I come from a family where the military culture is deeply imbued. And I have lived mostly, with a few exceptions, in small towns throughout my life. So all of those things fit. But I have never been a priest. I've never been a woman, from the South living in the North for the first time. I've certainly never been a man. I've never been the police chief of the small town. And then, of course, you have this whole panoply of different types of characters that show up. So what I always think of with the idea of write what you know, and I think it really pertains to what we're talking about tonight, is you need to write what you know about being human. And then the rest of it's kind of research.
Yes, okay. All right, that makes a lot of sense. I have some questions in a bit here about the human quality of writing and many of the things that we're experiencing right now, and I want to come back to that. But I also want to ask before I forget, Tess, I'm going to ask this question of you, but with many of these questions, now that we've gone around, I'd like anybody to sort of jump in. Specifically, Tess, who among your characters have been the hardest to write about in terms of getting inside convincingly? And can you offer an example or two of someone you've struggled with for reasons of gender or other reasons?
I think the hardest person to write about is actually the villain, because it's so far from me. I mean, how do you write convincingly about somebody who's a sociopath? And hopefully I myself am not a sociopath. And probably the hardest one I had to write, although in retrospect, he was not that hard, was the villain in The Surgeon, who is a horrible sociopath who kills women with pleasure. So how do you get into that head? Well, it helps by having read a lot of books about sociopaths and about serial killers, but in the end, you have to try walking in their shoes, which sounds creepier than it really was. So you begin to see the world in a different way as a hunter. I think he thought of himself as a hunter. And truly, I used to walk around the main mall, and this is really freaky, walking around the main mall and thinking, who among these people would I choose as a victim? Who looks like I could take her? And you look at the ones who have confidence. He's like, she's going to fight back, but that one over there, I might be able to take. And that's the kind of detail you have to get into by, embracing the sociopathic side of your character. So I think the villains are always the hardest ones to write because they are so different from us. Although they tend to be fun to write because they are so different from us. I find it harder, and maybe something about the difference between men and women. Sometimes men are incomprehensible to me. And I came about this because I recently wrote a book in collaboration with a man. The idea would be that I would write the female point of view and he would write the male point of view. So it's the man and the woman writing about each other, but looking at them. So the man is looking at the woman and the woman's looking at the man. And I would read his chapters, which are very sexual. I mean, he would see this young woman walk into his classroom and he goes there right away. she looks good, you know, all the sexual aspects of it. And I remember talking to him and I said, you know, this is kind of disgusting. Anybody who reads this book is not going to like this character. And he goes, but that's the way we think. And so I didn't believe it. I thought, it's just you. And I asked my husband, I said, is that really the way men think? And he goes, yeah. So that's when I realized there is a big divide between men and women and how we view each other. And I think I was also awakened by, there's a hashtag, or there's actually, it's a Twitter feed called Men Writing Women. Mm-hmm. Some of the things out of that are just eye-popping, and they take examples from books written by men about writing about women, and I'm just shocked at the way they think we are, or the way they think we think. So it's that divide. I think it's a gender divide that's really hard for me.
Do you think that experience of going back and forth with that male author will inform how you approach male characters going forward? Has it already happened?
No, because I'm very aware of the fact that my readers are women. You know, most fiction readers are women. And women want to read about men as they think they should be. And if a woman were to read a book about a man as he really is, they might not want to read that book. So yeah. I don't think I'm going to change my writing of male characters because I don't want to offend my female readers.
Yeah, makes sense. Good. Jim, you've created a lot of dramatic characters over the years, including a surgeon who cuts the hearts out of young women for sexual pleasure. You have an Iraq War veteran struggling with PTSD and other issues, and a victim of gang rape. A lot of your characters are very, very distinct. Are there, in those examples, were there different techniques and different research message for those different characters? And can you speak about that?
My research tends to be reading memoirs, as I said before. In terms of the young woman who was gang raped at a fraternity party in The Girl on the Bridge, to get into her head, I read memoirs of a half a dozen women who had the courage, and I think it takes a great deal of courage, to write about their own experiences with rape. And I think it gave me a sensitivity toward how they suffered from that and how it was a lifelong affliction. Certainly a form of PTSD, every bit as severe, and perhaps more severe than people in battle feel. In this particular instance, 12 years after the gang rape, this young woman committed suicide. And the rest of the book is devoted to her husband trying to find the 6 football players who were involved in the gang rape and getting justice for himself and for his now dead wife. But we got to know her pretty damned well. And first, the chapter where she is approached at a fraternity party. We don't actually see the rape on camera, if you will, but we know what goes on. And then we next see her 12 years later, married to the guy who was her date that night, walking out in the middle of a New Hampshire winter and going to a bridge and throwing herself off the bridge. And her husband is determined to find the bad guys. And that's what a lot of the book is about. It's he goes about it in a very different way, and one of the bad guys' wives also goes about finding the bad guys and punishing them. So I learned about rape by reading the stories of rapes from the point of view of the woman who suffered the rape. And I tried to put myself inside their heads. There were remarkable similarities among them in terms of the shock, the PTSD suffered, how they would never get over it, how one of the interesting things was several of them spoke how they couldn't talk to their friends about the experience of the rape and how it had affected them. They would get a reaction of, it's been 12 years, for God's sakes, get over it. And the friends didn't understand that it's something that they never got over, and led to suicide in the end.
In the course of writing that character and working on that book, did you find yourself living in that character's mind as a matter of course all the time when you were writing or not? Were you thinking about that on a recurring, constant basis? What's that experience like?
Well, it was very interesting. I'm a 70-something-year-old male come from a different generation. I'm writing about the experiences of a 17-year-old young woman who's a freshman at a college in upstate New York. And I'm getting inside her head and trying to understand how this event affected her psychologically. And I think I did a pretty good job of it. At least people who've read the book feel that I did a good job of it. They very kindly tell me so.
Yeah. Good. And the name of that book?
Name of that book is The Girl on the Bridge.
The Girl on the Bridge. And again,
all
all these books are kellysbookstogo.com.
Yeah.
This question's for everybody. I want to talk about some of your failures, characters that you've had to give up on either because you couldn't see their point of view or perhaps you didn't like them. Does anybody have a story about somebody you've tried to create and couldn't, or created and wanted to then not stick with?
Well, I do. Oh, do you want to go?
Julia, you go ahead first.
Okay. And this was so my, let's say, fourth book, To Darkness and to Death. The conceit that I was trying was that I was going to write a ticking clock mystery. It's going to be 24 hours. And all this stuff is happening in 24 hours. And then it wraps up with a big bang, literally. And there were multiple characters in this. There's the cop and the priest, and then there are the people who are involved in different aspects of the crime, or maybe they're involved in the crime. Of course, you have to have your suspects and your red herrings. And I wrote one young guy. He was the son of a professional logger. The part of this was about the closing of a 250,000 acres to logging and turning it over to an environmental trust. And I had him, he was sort of saying things and I had him doing things, and he just, there was something that just sort of fell flat. And I've written men before, and I've written young men before. And I think it was like he was a young, blue collar, not very nice guy. And I just could not click into him. And I actually wound up coming to a stop and not knowing what the heck was going on in the book. And I sent it to my editor and I said, help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi. I have, you're my only hope. And my editor read it over a weekend and she sent me back, a letter that said, I forgot, do this, cut that. And then she said, you need to do a characterectomy and just pull him completely out, because he was a cardboard character. There wasn't anything really three-dimensional about him. And I pulled him out, and sure enough, it was like he had never been there. There was nothing missing without him there, which is probably a really good test of whether your character is carrying his or her weight. It's like, if you can remove them from the book and nobody notices, then that character doesn't need to be there.
Tess, have you performed a characterectomy?
What I've done is I've changed the characters. Very often you'll start off with a cardboard character, and that's the way I usually create my characters, is I don't know who they are when I begin. It's a little bit like meeting somebody for the first time face to face. You know their gender, you know their race, you know their age, and only after a year of spending time with them every day do you finally find out who they are deep down in their souls. So it's the way I do with my characters. I don't know them very well, and rather than remove a character that's not working, I change that character. Very often they'll keep their name, but sometimes they even change gender.
Yeah.
I once had a character who started off as a man, and halfway through I thought, you're really boring, but if I make you a woman, you'll be interesting. And that's exactly what happened. So a lot of times they start off as placeholders and they grow on you.
And does that happen just because you live with them all the time and you think about them and you understand them better?
No, I think that there are some people, just like there are some people who you really are kind of bored by, you don't want to spend time with them. If your character is that way, you either get rid of them or you change them. You give them something that is fascinating to you. And that's usually what I try to do, is I try to make them somehow interesting.
Yep. Trust your instincts. Jim, you were going to add something to this question.
The most recent book that I have written, and I finished it a couple of months ago, was about a 20-year, the main character, the voice in the book was a 20-year-old young woman who meets a really handsome guy and falls in love. She also happens to be the daughter of a very rich technocrat billionaire, or millionaire anyway. And the question of the book is whether he's coming on to her because he's interested in her money or because he genuinely loves her. And I wrote the book and showed it to a lot of my trusted reader friends and got very negative reactions. And one, a woman named Jenny Fields, who's just published a terrific book called Atomic Love, I'll give her a plug, said, "You're not writing about sex from a woman's point of view," similar to what Tess said earlier. You're writing it the way a man would see sex and the sexual act. And you really have to flip it so that it sounds more like a woman's reaction to a guy. And she was absolutely right. I'm rewriting the book now. It's not a McCabe Savage book, but it's something quite different for me. And I hope that I get it right second time around.
I don't want to turn this into reading, but it occurs to me we should ask maybe if any of you folks are interested in reading a few pages from one of the characters we've talked about. Jim, do you have anything by chance?
Sure, I would love to read a little bit about my 20-year-old schizophrenic young woman, and she's in the pages that I'm about to read. She is fleeing. The book is called The Chill of Night. It's a very, very cold, very snowy winter, and she's running away from the murderer and not sure whether what she sees or what she hears is real or whether it's hallucination, and she's terrified. She's trying to get herself to a friend's house. Let me get to the right page here. Oops.
I shouldn't have sprung it on you. Sorry about that.
We weren't expecting this.
Yeah.
I put a thing in the book to tell me where it was, and I've so why don't you ask somebody else?
Sure, absolutely. So no, I want to bring this topic around to current events, actually, to some degree.
Oh, okay.
And well, no, actually, sorry. Does somebody else have a reading ready? I thought I heard someone type that. Okay. The idea of current events is interesting to me. The world is changing and obviously continues to change at a great pace. And Julian, discussing your character, Russ, the police chief from upstate New York, I'm curious how you might account for the social justice movement that's going on now that's making police more accountable. How Russ will you have him confront some of these things going on?
Yeah, that is a very pertinent question, and it's something that a lot of mystery writers that I know have been talking about amongst ourselves and thinking about it, because you sort of caught on the horns of dilemma unless you are doing a strict what is called cozy or an amateur sleuth, where the sleuth is just the country vicar, or the lady who's a caterer or something like that. You need to have law enforcement. If you're going for something that has a certain level of realism, you need law enforcement, because those are the people that investigate murders. But at the same time, I think that it's really beholden on us to think about how much we are responsible for sort of lionizing the profession, and how much we could change to really accurately reflect what's going on. Certainly by all, I have met and interviewed and spoken with any number of law enforcement officials at this point, all of whom really seemed very good people. But it's really obvious if you look at the news anywhere that there are also a lot of cops out there who are not good people. There are people who are being drawn into the profession. I have already had in previous books I have had some dirty cops, people who are on the take or who are doing things for entirely the wrong reason. Not so much because I had this great sense of social justice, but because it's interesting. It makes it really insightful. So the book that I'm working on now, the 10th in the series, is really presciently enough about white supremacists, which when you're writing in a small town, you know, there's a lot of thriller-like stuff that you can't really get away with. You know, there's nobody's going to set off a nuclear explosion in your small town or you know, irradiate the place, whatever. But there are, you know, in rural places, white supremacists, militias, things like that are a real issue and problem. So while I've been working on this, all of this stuff has been going on in the news and in our culture. And so I'm looking for ways within my book to maybe reflect that, reflect not just the white supremacy movement, but also what is the reaction of certain members of law enforcement to that. Because unfortunately, for some of them, it's kind of, you know, it's toss you a bottle of water and you're doing a good job. So I want to try and balance and reflect all of everything in the issue. And honestly, I think that will make my writing and other mystery writers' writing better. Because when you reflect the totality of a situation, when you make your characters as rich and well-rounded and your world as populated with real people as possible, it's just a more interesting read and a better read.
You mentioned in your introduction to that answer that this is a topic among mystery writers. How big of an issue is this, and how do you converse with your peers on topics such as this?
Well, I belong to a mystery blogging group called Jungle Red Writers. We are 7 women mystery writers who find us, jungleredwriters.com. You know, we are constantly talking on the phone and we do it then. I have Zoom get-togethers with other mystery writers. We've been discussing it at events like these because the question has been coming up regularly. And, you know, I know it's something that we're all turning over a lot.
Yep. Good. Tess, what are your thoughts on the topic?
Well, I actually spoke to Ray Ruthier about this. He had a column about how Black Lives Matter has affected us as writers. I went through a couple of weeks when I could not write after the first after the first cell phone videos were being broadcast on Twitter. I think that after I saw that, I was so horrified and so disturbed that I had a hard time writing about cops as heroes. Now, I've never had personally a bad experience with a police officer. I mean, in my mind, you know, they tend to be okay guys, but it's clear that that is not true for everybody in this country. And what I saw, some of the things that were done, this is one of the questions that came up in the chat room. Is there a character that you just cannot write from the point of view of? And I have to say that I don't think I will ever, none of us who are not African-American will ever deeply understand the pain that they experience. It's very, very hard to write from that level of pain when you haven't felt it yourself. So that is, that's probably something I'm not going to write about because I feel it's almost cultural appropriation. I feel that I cannot do it justice and I feel like I would be faking it in some ways. So that is one thing that I would avoid. And nevertheless, I do have Black characters in my book sometimes. But I think that when they appear in a Rizzolian Isles story, for instance, I just had a scene I had to write where there's a 16-year-old boy who may or may not be a suspect, and Jane comes to interview him. And in the old days, I would have just had this interaction of her interviewing this young boy. But now I was able to see the boy's fear. I was able to maybe reflect more on his feeling like this is going to be really bad, even though I didn't do anything. I think I'm just more sensitive to that because of the BLM movement.
Yeah, absolutely. Jim, thoughts on that topic?
Yeah, I've had several Black characters who mostly have minor parts in the books, but I think I tried to make them as interesting as I could. They're certainly different one from the other. In my first book, The Cutting, I had a young Somali immigrant to Portland who was working for the police department and was a brilliant young computer programmer. And he was doing a lot of the computer work while putting himself through college. And it was interesting writing about him. I didn't write in his voice or get inside his head, but he was a character that the police all liked. His nickname was Starbucks because he loved drinking coffee, not because he had anything to do with Moby Dick. And he was fun. In my last book that was published, The Fatal Obsession, there is an important Black character who's a very successful Black actor who is a big movie star and plays Othello on the stage in the opening of the book. And he's a small part, but he's a very different kind of character from the young Somali immigrant. I think I have a couple of other Black characters who have smaller roles, but that's, the Black Lives Matter thing has not really become part of anything that I've written about. I think it would be very tough to do so with the strong feelings that are going through the country at this point. I do think there are bad police. I think most police are very good and very honorable, but there's no question that there are those who are not. In one of my books, Darkness First, the villain is a state cop detective. He's also, on the slide, a drug dealer and a murderer, and he murders, I can't remember the exact count, but I think 7 people in the course of the book, Darkness First. But he's a lifelong police officer. So I accept that police, like anybody else, most of them are pretty good. Most of them care about their jobs. Most of them care about the people they work with. But there are the bad apples, there are the psychopaths, there are the sociopaths. And you just have to handle it that way. I think it's too soon to write a book about a novel, a fiction book about Black Lives Matter at this point.
We're going to go to questions from the audience in just a moment. I just want to follow up on another current event question, and then we'll turn it over to readers and viewers. I'm just curious about the coronavirus and if the pandemic has shown up in your writing yet, or in the minds of your characters, and if so, how?
Yeah,
That's
well,
yeah.
the book I'm writing now, it is sometime after the pandemic is over, but the characters are still very aware of it having happened. I think there's a scene where they're avoiding shaking hands because that is sort of like out of fashion now. You know, we're living through history, and this is history, and we cannot ignore it. So I think that books are going to start somehow including it in the stories, whether it's the central part of the story or not, I don't know, but I think our characters are going to be referring to pandemics in the future.
Yep.
I think there are going to be some really amazing novels written about this year that we have been living through. But I think it's going to take time for that to percolate through into a writer's consciousness. And the example I always think of is, I think one of the greatest, not novels, but greatest works of fiction about the Vietnam War is Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carry, which he published, I want to say something like 15 years after the end of the war. And there were certainly other works of fiction about Vietnam, you know, while the war was going on and after. But I think it takes a while to really filter things through and understand how this whole thing is actually affecting the culture and individuals. And as Tess says, we're in the middle of history. It's terrible history, but we're still in the middle of it. And it's really hard to see the battlefield in the fog of battle. You have to wait until the smoke clears.
Yeah, I agree. I think you have to certainly give yourself some distance from the actual events. We don't know how this pandemic will end. Hopefully it will end. At some point, I'm certain it will. But you've got to have a little bit of distance. I mean, there was a book that came out, God, probably 15 years ago called Contagion, which was made into a movie that was about something remarkably similar to what we're going through now. But that at that time was totally fiction. I mean, the author made it up, but did a very good job.
Yep. Gibson, if you're there you are. Do you want to turn some questions, turn some I'm sorry, turn this over to reader questions. There we go.
Yeah,
Sorry about
sounds
that.
great. Sounds great. I could listen to the four of you talk for longer, but we also have some great questions. So let's get some of those in here. And actually, why don't we start with that one that Tess actually gave an answer to, which I thought was a great answer. And I wondered if Julia or Jim wanted to weigh in. The question was actually from Jason Allison. He said, you're all established writers. Given the current cultural moment, are there any POV characters you wouldn't attempt to write? Other ideas on that one?
Yeah, I certainly agree with Tess. I do not feel competent to write a point of view character who is African American. I also have, you know, as it were, side characters in my books that have been African American. So that I feel like there's an increased sensitivity to the idea of writing outside your own experience. Now, that does not mean that I'm going to stick with nothing but, you know, middle-aged, middle-class women. That'd be really boring if that's it. But I do think that part of the ask from African American writers, from Latinx writers, from Asian writers is that people who have had a huge slice of the pie and most of the seats at the table don't edge them out telling their stories. Let those writers tell the stories of their own cultures. It doesn't mean not having them in a book if I'm a white, middle-class, middle-aged writer. It means being sensitive and not trying to tell their stories from their point of view.
Great. Thanks, Julia. So let's see, we have a question for Tess. Christy wants to know about Joyce O'Donnell. And the character died in the end, but we didn't really get her point of view. Was she the villain, or did she simply believe in helping villains? Clearly a reader who wants to wait and wants to know more.
Yeah, for those of you who don't know the book, it's the Mephisto Club, and Joyce O'Donnell is she's a psychiatrist who she's kind of a paid gunslinger who will come in and testify on behalf of the worst, most horrible serial killers, because that's what she does. And she's also probably a little bit of a sociopath as well. I never did her point of view because I guess I really wasn't sure what made her tick. But she's dead, so she died deservedly a bad death. Well done.
One of the great pleasures of writing mysteries, right? You get to give people what they deserve at the end.
Right?
No desire to bring her back from the dead, and
she was almost like a living vampire, sucking the blood off, of good people. That's but you know, do I dare say she reminded me a little bit of Janine Perot?
She may be watching. And she'll sue.
So this is something we were talking around earlier, because all three of you were talking about research and how you do that. Karen wants to know what comes first, research or the writing. Do you write and then fill in details with research, or the opposite, or all of the above?
I think that it's a combination of both. For example, when I was learning about schizophrenia, that came before the writing. And it wasn't until I felt very confident about writing in the voice and in the mind, in the point of view of a young schizophrenic woman, that I started the writing. But there are little things that come up all the time. In the same book, for example, there was a body that was found frozen in the back of a car in the middle of a very cold Maine winter. And the question came up, and I had no idea what the answer was. How do you autopsy a frozen corpse? And I looked naturally on Google, and there was an article called How to Autopsy a Frozen Corpse. And it was written by a pathologist from the University of South Carolina Medical School in Charleston. So I emailed her and asked her if she could send me the article. She did, but I asked her if I could talk to her, and she said she'd love to. And she taught me how to autopsy a frozen corpse. For those of you who are interested, first you have to let it melt. Otherwise, you're going to have, if you try to autopsy it right away, the outside will go bad while the inside is still frozen.
It's like trying to bone a frozen chicken. You just can't.
It's just what I was thinking.
Well, getting back to that question about character or research first. For me, it's always character first. And it's an unusual thing for me, but if I can hear the character speaking to me from the very beginning, that's like number one. If I can hear their voice, and I don't mean in a schizophrenic way, I mean you just hear this voice talking to you, and the way they speak, whether they have an accent, whether it's a young or old voice, it right away defines that character for me. So that's how it starts, and then I do the research as I go along, as I need it.
Yeah, agreed. I would say everything that Jim and Tess say. Certainly if you're going to be a writer, my advice is do enough research to kind of set you on the road, but not so much that you spend the next 5 years doing research and you never actually start to write the book. That's the real danger. Just enough to get the wheels going. And then after that, you can always, you can research as you go along, or you can research at the end and fix what you've already written.
I love the conversation earlier about the characterectomy, or cutting out a character. And we were, a few of you referenced, cardboard characters or characters that don't work. And Tess, you were just talking about hearing it. When you hear a character, that's a good sign. I'm wondering what the other signs are. How do you know, like, oh, okay, I've got a real person here. I've got a character I can really write about. What are the signs that you have for yourself to know, like, this is somebody I'm going to be able to write a whole book about, or a whole series about, or a couple, they might appear in a few books, because you all have characters that do that.
I think for me is if the character comes easily, if I can get into the character's mind easily, if I can speak with the character's voice easily, I know I've got a good character. When that becomes exceedingly difficult and I can't think what the hell I should say next about this particular character, it's a pretty good sign that the character is not a good one.
Yeah, I would say when you have a character who begins to surprise you and do things that are a little unexpected. I am not an outliner. I don't plan ahead and plot my books. I write them organically as they come. So sometimes, as Jim says, you can't really think, what is this person going to say next? And sometimes you're typing along and what they say next is, well, that's interesting. And then there's this sort of magic spark that happens and they begin to come alive, which is good. I think it's very important to start out with characters who have some potential, trying to look for people who are not sort of stereotypical or cliche. So for instance, I've got a character that I love in my books. She is the chief of police mother. She's a, late 70s, kind of slightly round woman with a tight perm, but she's, instead of being like a sweet little old lady, she's a social activist. And the first big scene that she has in a book, she gets arrested by her own son because she's leading a protest, an environmental protest. And she's just hell for wheels on, protesting and that sort of thing, which I like because I wanted to have an older woman, but I didn't want her to be, baking cookies and, I don't know, knitting socks or whatever. I don't know too many old ladies that do that. Most of the ones I know are hell on wheels.
They're out marching. Yeah. I think that the first thing that tells me that this is an interesting character is, do they have do they see the world in an unusual way? Is there something about the way they perceive the world that's unique? And that's what I love about older women characters, is just like, you know, Julia says. The book I'm writing now features really Jane Rizzoli's mother, who's gotten short shrift in the previous books, and the things she sees in her neighborhood. She, you know, there's this old Boston, what they say, when you get off the plane in Boston, if you see something, say something. I guess they say that in New York too. And so she feels the need to say something whenever she sees something, and she's very annoying to her daughter, because her daughter says, I don't want to hear this anymore. So she calls the local police and she says something about what she's seen, and they don't want to hear about it either. So she's being ignored. And that tells you a lot about what it's like to be a middle-aged woman who maybe is seeing a little bit too much. People ignore you. And that tells you a lot about, well, actually about middle-aged women in general. We're ignored. You know, once you've lost the bloom of youth, you become the person that nobody notices on the street. And that not only gives you a sense of powerlessness, it also gives you a sense of power, because now they're not paying attention to you, and you can do things and say things that get away with it.
I really thought one of my ideas, if I ever managed to start writing standalones, if I could work a little faster, I would love to do a book with a, you know, nice middle-class 60-year-old woman who's actually a hitman, because nobody would notice her. She could go anywhere just completely unremarked.
We make the best spies, yeah.
Yes.
I would read that book. We've got maybe time for just a couple more questions. Thomas, I think we might have answered this question already, but I'll just ask it, and if there's anything new to add, we can add. A question for all three writers. What would you say is the best way for a new writer to write their first book? Just write it, or plot it all, or just write it, plot it all, or research then write? It sounds like there's three options there.
I wouldn't say research then write, unless it's unless it's a very technical book. I say wait for the voice to talk to you. Wait for your main character to start speaking to you. And as soon as that character speaks to you in a vivid way, just take dictation and start writing. And I don't plot things out ahead of time. Just like Julia, I'm a very organic writer. In a sense, if you've plotted it out ahead of time, you're going to get bored with the writing, because you already know what happens. A lot of the fun of writing is finding out what happens, and that keeps us going.
It's very interesting, because when I started my first book, The Cutting, I read a whole bunch of books on how to write mystery novels, and most of them said, outline your book, then you've got a full outline, then you can start. Well, I did try to do that. And I discovered that by page 3 of my book, I veered off the outline and never went back to it, simply because it wasn't the characters I had created. The best friends I had in that book were my characters, and I just let them lead me. How they would investigate the crime, how they would react to their lovers, how they would react to sitting at a bar and drinking too much scotch. You get to know your characters. They become your best friends, particularly if they're continuing characters like McCabe and Savage. And I'm sure Rizzoli and Hiles, and I'm sure Julia's characters as well. You know them better than you know anybody. They live in your mind. You can absolutely unerringly know how they will react to certain situations. And it works. I think most writers that I've come across are what the term is seat pantser, short for seat of pants writing. But I think almost everybody does that. Doesn't stick to some rigid outline that was created before they knew what was going to happen in the book.
Although I know a couple of really good writers who are friends of mine who in fact outline everything extensively. So what I would say, prospective writers, is a quote from Jenny Cruzy, who is a writer I love. She does women's fiction and this sort of genre bending stuff. And she teaches writing, and she says, there are many roads to Oz. When you are starting out and you're sitting down and you're trying to write your first book, you want someone to give you a map and tell you what is the right way to do it. there is no right way. It's like parenting. There's no right way to do it. You just feel your way along, making stuff up as you go, and you hope that you're going to get a good result at the end. So the most important thing is to start your novel and then write the middle and then write the ending, because then you can fix it. You can always fix something as long as you've got it on page. Nora Roberts says, the only thing I can't fix is a blank page.
Yes, yes, yes. Never, and the other thing is I would advise people is, this is what happens to me, is that I try to edit my work as I'm writing. I end up stopping because you end up trying to perfect the first chapter again and again. So I allow yourself to write badly for the first draft. Just write it all the way through. And by the time you've finished, you've got to the last page. As with Nora, as Nora says, I can fix the bad pages, but I can't fix the blank pages.
Yeah.
How about one more? Karen writes, Stephen King has said a catalyst for his writing is often, wouldn't it be funny if? And then she wants to know, is there a catalyst for each of you? What are the catalysts for you? What gets a story idea jogging, going, maybe?
I would think just what if.
Yeah, almost anything can be a story catalyst. Newspaper story, driving past an old house. I once had an entire book that was started because I was out walking with a friend in upstate New York and saw a pretty much abandoned cemetery near the edge of a lake. That had a whole novel attached to it. Who would have thought? But yeah, Tess is right. It's whatever that idea is, and then you have to take it like Play-Doh and start. Remember that thing that you did where you put it down on the comics and it came up and you could see the picture of the comic on your Play-Doh, and then you could stretch it and make the characters look weird. That's sort of what you do. You take the idea and then.
Yeah, I think ideas are everywhere. I was once doing a workshop and somebody said, where do you get ideas from? And I said, almost anywhere, from the newspapers, from stories that you hear from people you know. And they said, what if you can't get an idea? And I said, well, why don't you steal one? And they all came out, great shock. I said, take somebody else's book, take their idea. When you write it, it's going to be very different. And I gave a little bit example. I rewrote Hamlet, only Hamlet happened to be the Secretary of State in the United States. The president had killed, the vice president had killed the president, who was Hamlet's father, of course. And we did a whole CIA spy thriller book based on the story and plotting of Hamlet.
All right, I think we are, there's always more questions, but we should probably wrap it up there. I wonder if any of the three of you have any recent reading that you've been doing, books that you've particularly appreciated, apart from the amazing books that you each have done yourselves recently. Anything that you want to recommend to our listeners?
Oh, I just finished a book. I'm sorry, I can't remember the author's name. Isn't that terrible? But the book is called A Woman of No Importance, and it is a nonfiction book about an American spy during World War II who pretty much led the underground in France. And she became one of the founding members of the CIA. Mm-hmm. So if you can read it, it's just gripping from beginning to end, all the ways that she just barely escaped with her life. And she did it all with one prosthetic leg.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah, I was going to say, I've seen that book. I think I saw it at the library, like in the before times or something.
Oh, yeah, go get it.
Yeah. So I am reading a book that is not available quite yet, by one of my favorite authors, Archer Mayer, who writes this amazing series set in Vermont. And his latest book is The Orphan's Guilt, which I keep wanting to say The Orphan's Quilt, which is not what it is. The Orphan's Guilt. And it is going to be out, I think very soon, at the end of this month or very beginning of October. And Archer Mayer is always somebody who is well worth reading.
Great, thank you.
I
Jim?
would recommend a book by a dear friend of mine, Jenny Fields. The title of the book is Atomic Love, and it's a historic post-World War II story. The main character is a young woman who was a physicist who was working in Chicago for Enrico Fermi, in the development of the atomic bomb. And she made a lot of major contributions to the development of the atomic bomb. And after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, she was overcome with horrible guilt. She quit her job, couldn't work as a physicist anymore. And then the FBI and an ex-lover, both of whom were involved in the development of the ex-lover was also involved in the development of the atomic bomb, and a spy story ensues from there. But it's great fun, and I would recommend it to anyone.
All right, 3 great recommendations. I want to thank you 3 for doing this. It's been a great conversation. Huge thanks to Bob for his wonderful questions as well. Thanks to Kelly's Books to Go, and everybody should go there right now if you haven't already and buy books by these 3 great folks. Thanks so much, everybody. It's been a really fun evening.
Thank you,
Thank
everybody.
you.
I appreciate hosting.
Thanks.
Thank
Thanks,
you, Bob,
everybody.
and thank you, Gibson.
Take care, everyone.
Good night,
Good
everybody.
night.
Good night.